Archaeodeath, walking in the footsteps of past funerals.
Hello, it's Professor Howard Williams here, and obviously on my Archaeodeath blog I explore lots of aspects of contemporary landscapes, in other words the last 100 years of landscapes of death, material cultures and monuments associated with the dead, commemorating the dead. And in a previous video I've outlined and introduced the Mortality special issue from May 2011, so 9 years ago, volume 16 part 2, in which I edited, stemming from a conference, a special issue of the journal on archaeologists on contemporary death, and I composed an editorial called Archaeologists on Contemporary Death. Now, in that previous video I did outline the rationale and the context, and I think the ongoing importance of future work to be done looking at the archaeology of the contemporary world and looking at mortuary and material cultures and landscapes. Obviously there are incredible ethical sensitivities here of how we work with and work close with communities that have ongoing relationships with the dead, and I'm not suggesting or advocating an intrusion into contemporary death rituals and imposing ourselves into contemporary mortuary environments, but I would outline the real potential of our study of the modern world and its large-scale, complicated, varied mortuary environments, from churchyards and cemeteries, crematoria and gardens of remembrance, and also the landscape itself, where ash scattering and indeed all manner of other memorial practices are going on. And the Archaeodeath blog addresses a lot of these. We talk about, I talk about lovelocks, I talk about floral deposits and roadside memorials, as well as memorial plaques on benches and other dedicatory mechanisms that we exploit, including coin trees, for example. So votive and also commemorative dimensions to these many practices we encounter in the landscape. And so my blog is about sort of those engagements. I engage with it as an observer, but with an archaeological gaze, but also I think I offer some kind of critical perspective on some of this material. So this all really developed for me over a decade ago, but I took it forward into this 2011 edited collection, and then I took it further in my writings and also in the blogging. Now, the paper I want to address is my contribution to this volume, Cremation and Present Past, a Contemporary Archaeology of Swedish Memory Groves. Now, this is an area that I actually acquired by accident, a piece of research acquired by accident, because I spent a lot of time in 2005, 6, 8, 9 and 11 in Sweden, doing fieldwork of various kinds and going around and observing churches and churchyards, rune stones and Iron Age cemeteries, and for my teaching purposes and developing courses on the Viking Age, but also because of my growing interest in contemporary deathways. And as an outsider, as a non-Swede, I thought it'd be a fun piece of work and fascinating piece of research to do a comparative analysis of hundreds of these minneslunden, these gardens of remembrance, or memory groves as it actually directly translates, that can be found in Swedish cemeteries and churchyards. And so while in this video, sitting outdoors near my home, just talking about it, I can't visualize these for you, but I do want to make the point that the paper does try to look at a large sample, contextualise it in relation to the historical and sociological literature, and look at the way that 20th and early 21st century churchyards have adapted ideals of integrating cremation into the natural landscape and the prehistory of Sweden through the combination of trees, lawns, sometimes deliberately reused ancient features, and indeed reused 19th century gravestones as features, and water features, fountains and ponds and benches, flower holders and lanterns. So this kind of assemblage, and each individual memory grove does it in a very different way, adapting to the historic churchyard, so adapting to the landscape or the topography of death in which it is situated. And so I talked about that variability and themes that I identified by looking through these different landscapes, travelling through them and taking digital photographs of them. So I was able to pull together a rich and varied picture as an outsider's perspective. Now, one of the distinctive features of the Swedish memory groves is the focus on a stone, on a lithic focus, often with the word Minneslund on it. And apart from that one word, they tend to be text free. So at one level they seem very depersonalised. So the dead are scattered and interred in these spaces, but there's no physical trace, no individual plot, no individual grave. So in that sense it's quite a radical rethinking of funerary traditions, where the dead are cremated and then interred within the churchyard or cemetery. And in that regard they are a challenge for our sort of individualistic social engagement with the dead. From another perspective though, they're not depersonalised spaces, but they're a way of integrating the dead into that historic environment, into that imagined idyllic Swedish landscape with concepts of nature and of prehistory or early history integrated into them, and the medieval architecture of the churches where often they're situated are part of that interplay. So I talk about how in the article how that operates, and how in some cases I use a case of Skällinge, a church in Gotland, how a famous Viking weather vane that appears in the church, and you can see there one of these ringerike of weather vanes, is replicated on a cross that is a focal point in the memory grove, and indeed the entire memory grove space is like a mock Iron Age burial mound. So almost like the modern Christian and or secular dead of Sweden are being integrated into a Viking past in death in that parish. And in many of these memory groves there's a connection to prehistory and early history, bearing in mind that from a Swedish or Scandinavian perspective the Viking Age is at the cusp of prehistory and cusp of history, that national emergence and origin myth. So they're very different from the traditional grave plot, and yet also there's a lot of connected themes, and indeed sometimes they are almost like an individual family grave writ large, but everyone is becoming part of that family in death. So this is an example of how we can take an archaeological perspective and say some fresh things, I think, about contemporary death rituals and contemporary memorial environments. And in that regard, I think it's a case study that I'm still quite proud of in illustrating an archaeology of contemporary death. Now you can read more about this on my ArchaeoDeath blog, and but for now I would just like to say thank you for listening, and to feel free to go and read up on my article, and to think about what future work we can do as archaeologists, as observers on the contemporary. And while we have to be very sensitive with the ethical dimensions of we're not going to be digging up fresh bodies, we're not going to be turning up and at funerals and intervening in people's mourning and loss, we are still able to provide a critical perspective on, and a long-term perspective on, contemporary death and its material cultures, monuments and landscapes. So with that, thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the ArchaeoDeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.